In police crime museums all over Europe, there are items of evidence that have brought some of the world's worst criminals to justice. Behind every object in these black museums is a fascinating and sometimes macabre story. Hanging, an ancient and sinister method of death, is most often associated with execution or suicide, but cases of murder which have been made to look like suicidal hangings are not uncommon in the history of crime. To catch such cunning killers, police and forensic scientists must identify the little differences. This was a lot harder around the time of our first case in the 1920s. It's a tale of love gone wrong and its grisly consequences. But at its core was the question, had a young girl hanged herself or had she been murdered? On the 5th of December 1924, 26-year-old Elsie Cameron got on a train bound for the town of Crowborough, Sussex, to see her fiancé of 2 years, Norman Thorne. Elsie was a girl on a mission. Things were a little rocky in her relationship, and she was determined to pin him down to marriage. The two had met in London, where they had both attended a Wesleyan chapel, and they had been engaged for nearly 3 years. Thorne had moved to Sussex to establish a poultry farm, but was finding it hard going. Elsie's family knew that she had travelled down there in hope of sorting out a date for the wedding. After 5 days with no news, they contacted Thorne. But when he had said she had never arrived, her father called the police. The Sussex police went to see Norman Thorne at the chicken farm, the ramshackle assortment of runs and hen huts. Thorne's shabby living quarters were in a converted brooding shed. He was happy to let them look around the place. Thorne appeared distraught at Elsie's disappearance and made a detailed statement concerning his whereabouts on the day she'd gone missing. He told police that he'd gone shopping in Tunbridge Wells that day and then returned home before going out later that night to see a local girl. He said that he'd been expecting Elsie the following day, December the 6th, but that when he'd gone to meet her from the station as arranged, she hadn't turned up. He seemed a credible young man. Elsie, on the other hand, was described even by her own family as neurotic. Thorne cooperated with the press, helpfully answering their questions and posing for photographs. But just after Christmas, new evidence emerged. 3 witnesses had seen Elsie walking towards Thorne's farm on the evening in question. Scotland Yard were called in. They interviewed Thorne at Crowborough police station, and while he was there, officers started digging at the farm. Thorne doggedly repeated his earlier statement to the police. But the next day, they dug up Elsie Cameron's small case. Thorne changed his story. He now told the police that Elsie had arrived at his hut unexpectedly on the afternoon of the 5th of September, entreating him to marry her, and saying that she wouldn't leave until the ring was on her finger. Thorne said that after he'd made a pot of tea, he left her alone, as he'd already arranged to meet Elizabeth Caldicott, the other girl who had a claim on his affections. He said that he returned around midnight and found Elsie's body hanging from a crossbeam in the hut. Elsie. Thorne described how, in a panic, he chopped her body into 4 sections. He wedged her head into an OXO tin and wrapped her legs and torso in sacking. He then buried the lot around the farm. Crowds of spectators watched as police unearthed the dismembered corpse. Amongst those fascinated with the case was the creator of Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
Conan Doyle lived in Crowborough at the time, heard about the case of Norman Thorne and the murder of his fiancée, being that the chicken farm was only a half a mile or so away from his own home. On his couple of visits he made to the farm, I think he was politely turned away by Scotland Yard, as they didn't really want an amateur sleuth getting in their way.
Thorne gave Elsie's reasons for the apparent suicide as her hysterical, neurotic state of mind. She had told him that she was pregnant, but he didn't believe her. And because he had fallen in love with another girl, Elizabeth Caldicott, he wouldn't agree to marriage. This, he said, gave rise to what he called a nerve storm and must have driven Elsie over the edge. In many ways, Thorne's actions were reminiscent of another case from the crime museum. Patrick Mahon had been found guilty of murdering his lover only months before, just along the coast in Eastbourne. After a violent row, Mahon said his girlfriend had accidentally fallen and died after banging her head. In a blind panic, he'd cut up her body and burned her head. Mahon's version of events was not believed, and he was hanged. Interestingly, when police searched Thorne's hut, they found a collection of cuttings to do with the Mahon case. Sir Bernard Spilsbury, the famous Home Office pathologist, who had worked with great expertise on the Mahon case, was called in again once Elsie's remains were removed from the farm. Spilsbury carried out the examination of the body parts and found evidence to suggest that she hadn't died from hanging.
As Sir Bernard said, I made a thorough search of the neck on the 17th of January because of the suggestion that the woman had died by hanging. Not only externally, but of the tissues under the skin. I found no single area which suggested hemorrhage or which suggested crushing of the tissues, and no thickening or reddening of the skin itself, resulting from pressure by a rope.
He also ascertained that she wasn't pregnant at the time of her death. Elsie Cameron was then buried in London. But just 4 weeks later, her body was exhumed and another post-mortem was carried out, this time for the defence. Thorne's defence had called on the skills of an Irish pathologist, Dr. Robert Bronte.
There was an undoubted personal rivalry between the two men, but it was also a professional matter, a clinical matter. They took different views of the case. At the second post-mortem, held at Willesden Cemetery, Elsie Cameron was examined not just by Sir Bernard Spilsbury, but by Dr. Bronte. By this time, Elsie's remains had deteriorated. The coffin at Willesden had become waterlogged, and water had entered the tissues, causing certain irreversible damage. Nevertheless, Bronte was convinced that there were signs on the surviving portion of the skin of the right side of the neck of hanging in some form or another. Spilsbury took a wholly different view. To Spilsbury, these were merely evidence of creases, natural creases in the neck.
At Thorne's trial at Lewes Assizes, the question of how Elsie had died dominated the proceedings. Spilsbury was the only medical expert called by the Crown, whereas, in addition to Robert Bronte, the defence called in 6 other doctors, none of whom had been present at the second post-mortem. They all agreed with Bronte that the marks on Elsie's neck suggested hanging. Spilsbury, however, wouldn't waver in his conclusion.
As he later said, I found nothing in my examination externally or internally to justify the proposition that there had been attempted hanging, cutting down before death, and death occurring immediately after. I found signs to rebut such a suggestion, which were injuries on the head, face, elbow, legs and feet, which together were amply sufficient to account for death from shock.
Furthermore, when a laundry rope was presented as a possible means of suicidal hanging, he said that such a method would have immediately made a mark on the neck, and this would certainly have been found when he examined the body on the first occasion. Another fact that weighed heavily against Thorne was that when police inspected the beam from which he said Elsie's body had been hanging, they found no rope marks, just a layer of thick, undisturbed dust.
You know, reading about Spilsbury, his reputation was very high profile, and maybe some of the jurors at the court in Lewes were swayed by that reputation and by way of the summing up of the judge at the time, which did lean towards supporting Spilsbury.
His opponent, Dr. Robert Bronte, was an Irishman, inclined to lose his rag in court, and overall not a very good witness.
In his summing up, the judge, referring to Bronte's opinion, stated that there was a view that there was some slight extravasation of the girl's neck. Then, referring to Spilsbury, he stated that his opinion is undoubtedly the very best that can be obtained. Then, after just 30 minutes deliberation, the jury agreed. They pronounced Thorne guilty of murder. He was sentenced to death. Arthur Conan Doyle, along with many others, strongly disagreed with the verdict.
Once the guilty verdict was there, Conan Doyle did continue to write to the press, pleading for a reprieve, but obviously was unsuccessful. Even up to the last hour, he was still campaigning, but in the end, Thorne was hanged. So it's one of Conan Doyle's failures, if you like.
Was he guilty of murder? Was he guilty of manslaughter? There was a real controversy engendered by the fact that the opinion of one man, Sir Bernard Spilsbury, had been ranged against the opinions of 6 other medical men. Thorne himself declared, "I'm a martyr to Spilsburyism." Well, in one sense, I suppose he was. Thorne was really the author of his own misfortunes. If he had admitted that he'd had a fight and a struggle with Elsie Cameron, he might have found himself with a verdict of manslaughter. He might have saved his neck.
On the day that would have been his hapless fiancée's 27th birthday, April the 22nd, 1925, John Norman Thorne was executed at Wandsworth Prison. He was hanged. Our next case is one where medical opinion was divided over the death by strangulation of another young woman. Was it suicide, or could it have been murder? This was the question that taxed 2 of the finest pathologists of the day, Sir Bernard Spilsbury and Sidney Smith, who for the first and last time were acting for the same side. It was 1931 in Glasgow, Scotland. On the 21st of November, a young man by the name of Peter Queen had walked into a police station and told the duty sergeant, Go to 539 Dumbarton Road. I think you'll find my wife dead. Queen then uttered the sentence that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would always maintain that he said, "Don't think that I have killed her." But the sergeant thought he said, "I think I have killed her."
Well, the officers who arrived there were confronted by a scene that was ostensibly quite normal and peaceful. When they entered the house, they would see Chrissy Gall lying in a bed in the main room in the house. She was wearing her boudoir cap, which was a piece of headgear worn by ladies in those days to protect their hairdo while they were sleeping. And there was no sign of a struggle or anything like that. They saw Chrissy Gall had a ligature tied very tightly round her neck, and she was dead.
Just hours later, the police charged Peter Queen with Chris's death.
To all appearances, Peter Queen was an inoffensive young man. People describe him as being quite affable and sociable, and he comes over at times as something of an innocent. I have my doubts about this because he came from the East End of Glasgow, a pretty rough part of the East End of Glasgow, and he spent most of his working life in the bookmaking business.
The relationship between 28-year-old Chrissy and Peter Queen was a loving one, but fraught with unhappiness. They had met and fallen in love 7 years earlier, when she was employed by Queen's father as a nursemaid. But Peter Queen wasn't a free man. When just 18, he married a girl who was discovered to be an alcoholic, and after just 2 years of marriage, they'd separated. This was the state of affairs when he met Chrissy. When Chrissy's mother died, she stayed at home to look after her father, and Queen became a regular visitor. This situation carried on for 3 years. They made a happy couple, though Chrissy, like Queen's wife, had a weakness for drink. After Christmas 1930, Chrissy and Queen moved into rooms of their own. But if anything, this made things worse. The main cause of the depression that fueled Chrissy's need for drink was the situation between her and Queen.
In those days, in Presbyterian Scotland, couples who were living together without the marital status were looked upon as living in sin, and they were looked down on.
In her darker moments, Chrissy began to talk about doing away with herself. And as Queen recalled in his statement to the police, she had attempted suicide just a week before her death. He'd woken up in the night to find her missing and discovered her in the kitchen. She was hanging from a hook on the door. On the day that she died, Chrissy Gall had been very drunk. A friend who had called in to see her at 2:30 in the afternoon had found her completely intoxicated. Shortly afterwards, Peter Queen had arrived and they had put Chrissy to bed. The friend and her husband had stayed with Queen until about 11:15 that night. Chrissy woke several times and drank hot sugar water and ate some sandwiches in bed. At his trial, Peter Queen testified as to what happened next. He told Chrissy that the doctor would call round to see her in the morning and she'd asked him to get out the best pillow slips. Queen said that he'd been unable to find them, but when he told her this, she hadn't answered and he thought she was asleep. He then sat down and had a drink. Later, when he was ready to go to bed, he said he saw that she had a rope around her neck and that her face was swollen. He realised she was dead. Queen told the court, "I called out, 'Chrissy, Chrissy,' and I was shocked and completely knocked out. I don't know what I did for some time. When I came to my senses, the first thing I thought of was to go to the police." The opinion of the pathologist who carried out the initial post-mortem was that she had been murdered. But when Sir Bernard Spilsbury and Sidney Smith, both acting for the defence, examined the evidence, they were inclined to believe Peter Queen's version of events. This was for several reasons. There was the undisturbed state of the room where Chrissy Gall had died. The body was in a very natural position, and her dentures were in place, with her tongue only a little forward in her mouth.
A victim of strangulation usually shows three typical pathological features. There's the cyanosis, the blueness of the skin associated with lack of oxygen in the blood. There's the congestion also, and that's caused when the pressure on the neck allows the blood to enter through the arterial system but not escape through the venous system. But the third feature is most important pathologically, and that is the tiny pinpoint hemorrhages in the skin and in the eyes that are known as petechial hemorrhages.
There was also the position of the rope and the knot.
If the ligature is tied, then the knot is a very important forensic clue, and a considerable amount of time is spent in preserving that. Usually the ligature is photographed in situ and then cut at a point away from the knot so that the knot is preserved and is available for future examination. It was Spilsbury's view that there was very little injury to the neck in this case. He thought this was important, since in murders there is normally continuous pressure applied by the ligature, causing considerable damage to the skin and bruising to the muscles. Spilsbury accepted that self-strangulation was extremely unusual, but he thought that that was what had happened in this particular case.
Sidney Smith concurred, but in a book written many years later, he admitted to having some reservations. What had worried Smith about the suicide theory was the question of the half knot. How, Smith wondered, would a rope tied only with a half knot keep tight enough to cause asphyxia after Chrissy had lost consciousness and her hands had let go of the ends? It seems like Spilsbury had no problem with this. He had examined the rope and pointed out to Smith how fibres bite into one another when they're crossed. This showed, he said, that they would hold the knot tight enough after her grip had relaxed. The prosecution queried Queen's reaction to finding his loved one dead.
I would have thought that finding her dead, he would have rushed from the house and gone for assistance to a neighbour or anyone. But in actual fact, he calmly donned his jacket, his hat and coat. He walked out the house, locking the door behind him. He went down into the street, and there, in the early hours of the morning, he met a police constable. And instead of telling the police constable that his cohabitee was lying dead in bed, he just asked for directions to the nearest police station.
And then, of course, there was his initial statement that the police insisted had been, "I think I have killed her," and not, "Don't think that I have killed her." Relatives and friends of Chrissy Gould testified to Peter Queen's good character and love and kindness to Chrissy in the face of her continuous bouts of depression. Evidence was also given of Chrissy's threats to drown herself in the River Clyde, and how on one occasion she had locked herself in the flat and turned on all the gas taps. However, the friends who had been with Queen and Chrissy gave conflicting evidence. Neither could agree as to how drunk Chrissy had been, a fact that couldn't be scientifically proved. The pathologists who had performed the post-mortem had failed to examine her stomach contents or blood. Although Queen had no obvious reason for the crime, the judge in his summing up said, "It is not always possible to discover the motive which animates human conduct." After only 2 hours of deliberation, the jury gave its decision, a majority verdict of guilty.
The majority was 10-5, and of the 5 who were for acquittal, all of them were for the peculiarly Scottish verdict of not proven. No one was for not guilty.
Queen was sentenced to death, but 3 days later, after what seemed like half the great and the good of Glasgow had spoken up in his defence, this was changed to life in prison. Did he murder Chrissy Gould? Sidney Smith supplies one likely answer in his account of the case. He imagines a scenario where Queen, goaded by incessant talk of suicide, might have cut the rope and thrown it to her with the remark, "Well, if you want to die, take this and get on with it," not expecting for one moment that she would. But Joe Craig feels differently.
I've come to the conclusion that on the night of the murder, Peter Queen had had enough of Chrissy Gould, and I think the man just snapped, and he cut a piece of rope off the pulley and strangled her. He served in prison until 1944. When he was released, he then went back to his previous job as a bookmaker's clerk. He lived in the East End of Glasgow, and he appears to have lived quite a useful life until the end of his days.
Hanging suggests suicide, whereas when a person is found strangled, there's a strong suspicion of murder. Telling the two apart is not always straightforward. Both the Thorne and Queen cases show that even the best minds in forensic medicine can have opposing views. Views that, for Queen, ultimately spared a life, but in the Thorne case, condemned a man to death.